It is Friday, February the 22nd, 2019. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, Victor Hugo Green in his book, his little green book, the story of traveling wild black in America in the early 20th century. Happy Black History Month, everyone. Of course, Black History Month, my favorite month. Black history is American history. But before we get to all that, just a brief reminder that today's show is brought to you by listeners like you, folks who go to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. Just about a dozen patrons away from my next goal. I would like about 80 paying customers. That would be amazing. So if you want to help me reach that goal, you can go to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. If you do not want to be a recurring donor, but have a little cash to spare, you can go to paypal.me/distantpeasant. Send me a few bucks to cover my time in researching and putting together these episodes for your enjoyment. One last thing before I get started. I recently recorded a little side episode with some friends of mine about Bernie Sanders' announced presidential run for the 2020 nomination on the Democratic ticket to be president of the United States. There'll be a link in the description/post below where you can check that out if you want to. So I recently went to Brooklyn, and to get there I had to hop in a car. And then I had to drive that car to the airport and then hop on a plane and fly to New York and hop in another car and get downtown. And from there, get here and there in New York City for a few days. Never once did I have to worry that an establishment would not serve me if they were open, as long as I had the money to pay to get from here to there. It hasn't always been that way for everyone in this country. Now, we all enjoy, or I do at least, stories of valiant political beacons standing amidst that sea of humanity called peasant or proletarian or ordinary or simply unimportant. Basically those who have only their labor to sell and whose power to rise in the world is severely watched by the forces of order. Now maybe they organize or advocate or teach the masses. Maybe they channel the masses' righteous passion through direct action or words on the page. Whatever the case, we aren't really going to talk about anyone like that today. Victor Hugo Green never held public office of any kind, really. Passed no laws, founded no governments, started no revolutions, held no great wealth, no great power, wasn't even a famous civil rights activist. He was just a mail carrier, a war veteran, a travel writer, and the descendant of slaves. Despite all this, as a man of both humble beginnings and more or less humble life, born November 1892 in Manhattan, New York, Green would go on to have a profound impact on millions of people's lives for the better. The fact that his mission could have existed at all is a profound stain upon the United States, but the story of how progress occurs shouldn't, as an example, be the simple story of how we once had legal segregation until we didn't, and of those who fought for equality and of those who fought against it. Certainly these first order questions are, well, first order and worth asking. But we miss something when we leave out these secondary stories of how people lived under, grappled with, subverted, or reinforced legal racial segregation. So today I will try to explore a little bit about the world Victor Hugo Green lived in, why and how his little green book came to be, and how it was used to change the world. As for the man himself, I'll tell you as much as I can, but there actually isn't really a great deal to tell. He grew up in Hackensack, New Jersey, and in 1913, as a young man, he began working as a postal carrier in Bergen County, the most populous county in New Jersey. In 1918, he married Alma Duke, a relatively recent transplant from Richmond, Virginia, and part of a great migratory movement of black people fleeing the South in the early 20th century. So great, historians often just call this the Great Migration, which is a little too broad, I think. Others call it the First Great Migration, which is both more descriptive and not. Still, others call it the Great Northward Migration, which is really what it was, but whatever you call it, it contributed to vibrant black communities and a budding middle class, as well as a revival in literature, art, and the most important cultural contribution the United States has ever produced, jazz. Now, though the Greens faced prejudice and legal segregation where they lived, it was still better than in the old Confederacy. In 1916, the typical wage in a northern factory paid about triple what a black person could expect to make working the land in the South. Now, these communities in the North were in places like Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, and New York City. Naturally, Harlem specifically, which is where the Greens ended up putting down roots, where they moved after they married like so many other black families. According to Green's account, the idea for his famous book, known first by its proper name, the Negro Motorist Green Book, came from a few different places. First, his own experiences traveling, common to black people among others of the day. Frustrations over where it was okay for him to eat, sleep, get gas, etc. I'll talk more about this world momentarily. The second was other travel guides. Specifically, in his mailbag, he carried copies for delivery of what would amount to, in hindsight, green books for Jews. Books detailing where Jewish travelers and vacationers could find reasonable accommodation. In 1930, for example, Hackley and Harrison's Hotel and Apartment Guide for Colored Travelers covered board, rooms, garages, etc. in 300 cities across the U.S. and Canada. Lastly, his job as a mail carrier meant he had other people with other routes in New York to ask about this business or that one, as well as the anecdotes of his friends and community about how hard it was just to travel while black at the time. Before we move forward, let's talk a little bit about travel while black at the time. In 1896, of course, the United States Supreme Court ruled definitively that separate but equal facilities based on racial category were constitutional. Most people have at least heard of this case itself, Plessy v. Ferguson. Now, in practice, these separate facilities for non-whites were often non-existent and nearly always inferior when they did exist. In the late 19th and early 20th century, traveling by rail over vast distances for vacation or event or what have you could actually be fairly comfortable and speedy, despite the primitive technology of the day. But not if you weren't white. In that case, Jim Crow's car, old, uncomfortable, often smelly and ill-maintained, were what you rode in. And these were more and more a problem as generations of African Americans now had disposable income and leisure time, with higher wages and living standards than before. One thing that helped ameliorate this problem a bit was the increasing popularity of the mass-produced automobile. No longer an unreliable toy of the rich, the car, while less reliable and efficient than today's, really came into its own as a means of personal conveyance in the 20s and 30s, and it offered an alternative to riding in segregated train cars for African Americans. It also allowed for a degree of spontaneity, that one could hop into the auto together, just take off on a holiday, and allowed for the explosion of traveling salesmen, touring musicians, motels, and much else that we enjoy in America today. Personal mobility was making huge leaps forward. not least among African Americans, but much of the country's legal and social system had not moved on at all. Keep also in mind that while the car is here and is relatively cheap now, the interstate highway system is definitely not, so long trips nearly always meant passing through unfamiliar towns and cities. Now, you may assume that this problem of traveling while black was bad in the South, and it was. In fact, in huge swaths of the South, it was basically too dangerous to be black and prosperous enough to own a car. The act of relieving oneself was basically life or death every time. If you could not find a bathroom, a white local seeing a black person peeing on the side of the road could very well get them killed. It could be very easy to find oneself stranded without gas or oil or any mechanics, or hungry and cold with nowhere to go. Trips to see relatives in the South or do business there as a black person often involved packing days' worth of cold chicken, boiled eggs, whatever would keep for a little while, and either planning your bathroom stops very carefully or bringing a bucket or coffee can to go in. Yes, really. It also meant carrying extra gasoline, oil, blankets, mechanics tools, all kinds of incredibly tedious bullshit. Now, in the Midwestern and Western parts of the country, things could actually be just as dangerous, maybe more so, believe it or not. In addition to just being more sparse and spread out, sundown towns proliferated, not in the South, but in the North and Midwest. So called because it was not safe to remain in town after dusk. Additionally, more or less, the further west you went, the more spread out everything was, whatever the color of your skin. And in some places, even the vending machines had whites-only signs on them. Around 6% of the motels on Route 66 at the time were open to black people. Salt Lake City in the 30s had no accommodations for any black people whatsoever. In 1909, some of the white residents of Anna, Indiana, drove out every black family in the city limits. Common local adage at the time held that Anna was an acronym for Ain't No N-Words Allowed. As late as the 1950s, the finance minister of newly independent Ghana could not eat at a Howard Johnson's in Dover, Delaware, even after he told them who he was. Large suburbs by 1960 remained sundown towns, despite their explosive population growth. Glendale, California, population 60,000. Levittown, New York, population 80,000. Warren, Michigan, population 180,000. All sundown towns in 1960. In fact, around 10,000 sundown towns existed that year in the United States. Efforts to restrict town residency to whites only were not restricted to keeping only African Americans out. In fact, in 1870, a third of Idaho was ethnically Chinese, and almost none remained by 1910 after waves of violence and harassment. Indeed, Idaho is, as of the 2010 census, almost 90% white, a direct legacy of these lynchings. Gardnerville, Nevada, blew a whistle every day at 6 p.m. to let all the Native Americans know it was time to leave town. Roadside signs in Colorado would read, "No Mexicans after night." Anyway, into this world the African-American motorist comes, and though he is free of Jim Crow's dilapidated train cars, the spontaneity of motor travel is pretty diminished when where to sleep, what to eat, where to piss, and where to get gas all become extremely vexing questions that might cause embarrassment at best and be deadly at worst. Now, it would be nice if the world were not so, of course, and every business open to the public were legally required to serve that public without regard to race, but we will have to wait till the 1960s for all that. And non-white people want to travel here and now with the automobile, not with the law. Indeed, the radio, the car, the railroad, the transatlantic cable, all these will do much to shrink the world and make travel an ever more common activity, not just for pleasure, but for necessity, for everyone of all ethnicities. Athletes, entertainers, salesmen, business travelers all use the Green Book to make their working lives possible, as well as vacationers and others. Carry your Green Book with you. You may need it. Read the cover. Now, in cosmopolitan New York City, who would serve whom and under what conditions could differ drastically between establishments just a few streets apart. And it was New York City in which Victor Hugo Green lived and worked. So the first edition of the Negro Motorist Green Book was published in 1936 after a few years of research and was limited just to listings in New York City, a state of affairs that would last a single year. In his introduction, Green concluded by saying, quote, "There will be a day, sometime in the near future, when this guide will not have to be published. That is when we as a race will have equal opportunities and privileges. In the United States, it will be a great day for us to suspend this publication, for then we can go wherever we please, and without embarrassment. But until that time comes, we shall continue to publish this information for your convenience each year." End quote. Green elsewise rarely, though not never, editorialized in his guidebooks, though he would often reprint letters from readers to do his editorializing for him. Quote, "It is a book badly needed among our race since the advent of the motor age. Realizing the only way we knew where and how to reach our pleasure resorts was in a way of speaking by word of mouth until the publication of the Negro Motorist Green Book, we earnestly believe that it will mean as much, if not more, to us as the AAA means to the white race," end quote, said one reader. As an aside, this book will eventually be so popular that in 1955, AAA will endorse and use the guide itself. Civil rights leader Julian Bond, who didn't send any letters to Green but nonetheless spoke about his book, said, quote, "You think about all the things that most travelers take for granted, or most people today take for granted. If I go to New York City and I want a haircut, it's pretty easy for me to find a place where that can happen. But it wasn't easy then. White barbers would not cut black people's hair. White beauty parlors would not take black women as customers, hotels, and so on down the line. You needed the Green Book to tell you where you could go without having doors slammed in your face," end quote. Ernest Green, no relation to Victor Hugo, one of the first 9 black students admitted to Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, and the first of those students to graduate, navigated the 1,000 miles from Arkansas to Virginia with his mother, aunt, and brother to attend his sister's college graduation as a teenager. Every part of the trip was planned using the Negro Motorist Green Book, which I should tell you was also variously called the Negro Travelers Green Book. One note I want to slide in here is you've probably heard me talk a lot about the embarrassment or humiliation or inconvenience associated with the denial of service that this book shielded travelers from. Green himself obviously talked a lot about this in the marketing and words of the book, and it's all true, for sure. But one reason I think they hammer the message of embarrassment and humiliation so hard is because it's a way of reinforcing an implied or worse when imagining being denied service. It's not really great business sense, I suppose, anyway. I mean, dirtbag socialist that I am with views on marketing, to talk about how your book can keep you safe and unbeaten up or unlynched. But by hammering the humiliation and embarrassment angle, I think pretty much everyone knew exactly what that meant in addition. Now, the book came to include a quotation on the front in fine American fashion. It at least quotes one of our finer writers, Mark Twain, quote, "Travel is fatal to prejudice," end quote, from his humorous travel chronicle through Europe and the Holy Land, entitled The Innocents Abroad, or The New Pilgrim's Progress. The longer line is, quote, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime," end quote. Travel, therefore, being fatal to prejudice for the untraveled, for to broaden your horizons is antithetical to closed and narrow thinking, according to our lettered ancestor. Green's employment of the quotation is actually smarter than just a straight homage, as it inverts the original meaning and is hammered home by his own addition below the quotation, quote, "Travel strengthens America." Travelers using Green's book, whose circulation would reach millions in time, were effective at breaking down barriers of prejudice and commerce, at least in a limited sort of way. Better off black travelers would come to complain a bit about the quality of accommodations offered in the book when compared to what their dollars could buy if they had been white. But over time, Green's book helped spread, well, love of green. That is cash money, yo. Which some white folks, bigoted in their hearts or not, would always yearn for a share of. The book itself focused on 4 major categories of establishment. Hotels, motels, tourist homes. These are basically proto-Airbnbs where better off families with big houses could rent out rooms to travelers. And restaurants. 3 of the 4 major categories, in other words, concerned with the question that hung darkly over many black people's minds every late afternoon. Where will you spend the night? However, the book also contained information on service stations, garages, as well as nightclubs, leisure clubs, beauty parlors, and other miscellaneous stuff. Listings included both white and black-owned businesses, so long as they were known to cater appropriately to black people, which was verified periodically by reader testimonial, and eventually Green's own agents in the field. Esso gas stations, that's ESSO, today better known in the U.S. by the brand name ExxonMobil, did a little bit to help the popularity of Green's book in 1949, when it included an endorsement message from the company and began stocking the book in its stores, which it also sold via mail order. Esso, which franchised gas stations to African Americans, which was a rarity in the United States at the time, got some of these owners' photographs included in the Green Book. Shell gas stations, by contrast, were notorious at the time for refusing service to black customers. Victor Hugo Green was eventually able to retire early from the Postal Service and employ a few people at a publishing office and later a travel and booking agency he set up after World War II, during which, of course, publication had been suspended. By 1952, the book's coverage had expanded to international destinations, commonly reached by boat or plane as well, and generally the immediate post-war boom was the second golden age for the Green Book. Just as one fun example, take Macon, Georgia, in the 1949 edition of the Green Book. Macon, Georgia is the next town over from me of any consequence. People have been living there for something close to around 14,000 years continuously. However, Macon was so inconsequential that General Sherman did not even bother burning it to the ground on his way to Savannah. However, by the early 20th century, it had become a fairly bustling little town. As more and more, it served as a railroad hub and textile manufacturing center, among other things, with around 70,000 people in it, of whom maybe a quarter were black. And if you needed a garage for your car in Macon, and you weren't white, the Green Book had exactly one listing for you in the whole damn city. Carry it with you. You may need it. Now, the common line is that the Green Book was a fortunate casualty of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended legal discrimination at businesses based on race. But what's more accurate to say is that the Green Book was really eroded by the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, which, along with the Green Book itself, did much to erode discrimination among businesses in some parts of the country before any law was passed. In a way, this legislation, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, was really a strong follow-up punch from Uncle Sam upon the already pulpy face of legal segregation, having first been bloodied by the cold, hard logic of cash and the passion of increasingly bold civil rights activists. Now, however much weight you want to give to this factor or that one, the Green Book's influence began to rapidly decline in the 1960s, though the publication attempted to keep the brand alive with an international edition and dropping the title to Travelers Green Book in the last edition, published in 1966. This cover featured a drawing of a white woman water skiing. Victor Hugo Green did not live to see any of this. He died in 1960. Civil rights activists themselves had begun to see the Green Book at this time as an almost sinister accommodationist tool in some cases, one that allowed them to navigate legalized prejudice rather than confront and defeat it. Gone were the days when the book was the key to a sort of overground railroad, one that illuminated a hidden world strangely nestled in plain sight, one that allowed people to travel for pleasures both simple and indulgent, or for business big and small, as many users of the Green Book have attested. And though the book was effective at eradicating discrimination itself, it did more so through the vehicle of good old-fashioned American business sense than anything else. If the Shell station across the street is notorious for only serving white people, you zig where they zag, whatever bigotry's in your heart, if you want to make money. And you market yourself as the friendly gas station that will not just be happy to serve you, but even franchise a station to you, maybe. All that being said, for the better part of 2 generations of humanity, Green's book, among other similar guidebooks, literally made life possible for millions of people. It let them do their jobs. It let them celebrate important occasions and events together, graduations, funerals, births. It told them where it was not just possible to get a meal, but whether you could get a meal. It probably saved lives, made relationships possible. In short, it contributed massively to human happiness among people for a long time, mostly black people, but people of all races and ethnicities whose lives were changed for the better through travel that was made possible not just through the brilliance of human ingenuity or the collective public infrastructure, but the book of a humble mailman from Harlem. Victor Hugo's Green Book was basically forgotten until the early 2000s. In fact, copies today are so rare that even damaged ones will sell for tens of thousands of dollars. There's a 2018 film, a comedic drama called Green Book, named after it. The Green Book itself is consulted in the movie, but the movie is not really about Green Book. There's a single documentary film from 2016 about it, where travelers who used it, as well as Victor Hugo Green's relatives, are interviewed, called Green Book Chronicles. Other than that, there's some museum exhibits, library collections, a few pop culture references, and that's basically all there is about the Green Book and Victor Hugo Green. But I hope the next time you hop into a plane, a train, or an automobile, or for the truly stylish, you travel by Zeppelin or luxury cruise liner, and you head through an area that isn't quite so familiar to you, that you remember that it wasn't just this nameless, faceless mass of back in the day that made it so that you can take such travel for granted, whatever your skin color, while others in the past could not, notwithstanding our still extant tradition of racial profiling among security and law enforcement. No, it was also the people themselves that lived then that made it so. But with Victor Hugo Green's book, you at least stood a chance. Thank you for listening. Sorry, it was just me again today. Happy Black History Month, everyone. See you